chapters of the Quran, for example, Surah Al-Fil, Surah Quraysh, where they point out specific events in the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam before he's even has announced himself as the Prophet of Allah. It speaks, I think, volumes about the character of Rasulullah. Speaks volumes about, again, something that we can learn from these historical accounts with regards to theology and theological understanding, because, of course, among some scholars and mutakallimin, they say, well, the Prophet, he only became the Prophet when he was given the revelation. And at least among most of our scholars, they said that no, the Prophet, he knew that he was a prophet even before the time of Ba'athah. And so these verses that specifically point out the life of the Rasulullah before that point of Ba'athah, that shows us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to pay attention to his life even prior to the point of Ba'athah. Then there are verses which, again, we'll point out as we are covering these time periods, where there may not be as specific to the life of the Prophet. For example, Surah Al-Fil and Surah Quraysh, where we know that, when Allah says, "Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil," we know that this is an event that happened prior to Ba'ath, or where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about rihlat ash-shita'i was-sayf, we travel in the summer and the winter, something that happened in the life of Rasulullah before the time of Ba'ath. And Allah is saying, look at these things. But even if we don't have a verse or chapters that are so specific, what we do find as well is that even the way the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he carried himself prior to the Ba'ath, it was complete, you could say, conjunction and in complete alignment with the Quran. So in other words, that even though technically, if you want to look at from the perspective of theology, so well, he's not the prophet yet. He hasn't announced himself as a prophet or announced his prophethood, but nonetheless, his lifestyle is in complete line with the Quran itself. And it'll become clear as we go forward. So in the year 585, where we mentioned that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he was engaged in the sacred wars, the battle that began during the sacred month of Dhul Qa'dah. Of course, we see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he states about these sacred months in Surah At-Tawbah, where he says, "Inna iddata shuhuri 'inda Allahi ithna ashara shahran." So there are 12 months before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fi kitabillah. Something that, again, when we look at the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is something that is evident, not simply even the Quran, but the months that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has put forth. There are 12 months in a year. And among those, he says, وَمِنْهَا أَرْبَعَةٌ حُرُمٌ. So there are 4 that were sacred. And these 4 months, which are Dhul Hijjah, Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, Muharram, and Rajab, they were sacred even in a time of that era which we call Jahiliyyah. So this in itself, hopefully it changes our perspective a bit, that, oh, well, Jahiliyyah, everybody was ignorant. Yes, there was a lot of people who were perhaps illiterate, but that Jahiliyyah also meant those individuals who were not abiding by the Sharia that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put forth. And that was perhaps the Sharia of Ibrahim, those who were Hanif, which we know that the Quraysh, they were following that, some who were Christians and some who were Jews. And if they weren't following that, they were in this state of what was called Jahiliyyah. But nonetheless, those sacred months were known among all the people who were living in that time. So one of the things that we learned, and I just put a few bullet points on the side so that we can perhaps discuss these as well, or just give us a platform to start our discussion. So not all time is the same. There are some certain times which are sacred. For example, these sacred months. Of course, we may notice that Ramadan, the Shahr Ramadan, is not mentioned there among them, but nonetheless, it is a sacred time. It is a sacred month. But these were there before. The Qa'dah, the Hijjah, the 2 months in which we make Hajj or we make Umrah, and then Muharram and Rajab. So also, one of the things we know, although these are sacred months as well, if we pay attention to the verse itself, again, I'm not reading the entire verse. As I'm speaking, you can read the verse. But what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He states that yes, although these months are sacred, one should not be exploited by their enemies. This is one of the points that comes out. So it says that, look, don't start war in this time. But if war is started with you, then you have an obligation to defend yourself. It says, وَقَاتِلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ, and here, وَقَاتِلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ كَافَةً كَمَا يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ. So if they were aggressors against you, then you have to defend yourself. So even if one would say, well, yes, so Rasulullah, he participated in that war because during that sacred month, and he did so not to violate the sanctity of that month, but because the Bani Kinana were the transgressors against the Quraysh.
Sheikh, so these 4 months are sacred now.
Yes, these 4 months are still sacred, and they're sacred now.
There's no time.
Absolutely, they're still sacred. Yes. Okay. Any other questions or comments? But yes, they're sacred. They're still sacred till today. And of course, one that perhaps stands out, particularly for us as sacred month, is Muharram. One of the months that even prior to the final message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Muharram was a sacred month, that no war should be started in that month. But unfortunately, as we see that 50 years after the wafat or shahada of Rasulullah, that the war was started, and Imam Hussein alayhi salam was martyred in that sacred month. So now when we come to that next period in which we put in our timeline, 590, where this peace treaty was established, one of the things that sticks out, or at least a verse that we can, or chapter that we can kind of coincide with that moment, or what the objective of that peace treaty was, and how the Prophet's participation in that action, it coincided with the Quran. If we look to Surah Al-Ma'un, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ فَذَلِكَ الَّذِي يَدُعُّ الْيَتِيمَ وَلَا يَحُضُّ عَلَى طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ. So, and until the end of the chapter, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He points out that for Iman, there are a couple of criteria. Of course, one of the criteria that we kind of readily know, we say, okay, yeah, someone who believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, someone who believes in prophethood, someone who believes in Ma'ad, the hereafter. That if you're lacking one of these things, then that means that there's a lack or the deficiency in faith. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He points this out in the very first verse, that have you not considered he who calls the judgment a lie, that they don't believe in resurrection. So someone who removes that, they don't believe in the hereafter. All they do is they put all of their commitment, their weight, and their hopes and everything in this world. But someone who believes in the hereafter does not do that. And likewise, someone who refuses to support the orphans and look out for those who are, again, in a, you could say, a volatile situation. This is also a show of lack of faith. And the sign of faith is to pay attention to those who are going hungry. Why? Because not doing so is a sign of lack of faith. So if one is providing for those who are hungry, one is trying to establish justice, or as we said today in our khutbah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands, He says, "I'dilu huwa aqrabu lit-taqwa." That be just and be those individuals who establish justice. Why? Because this is the closest thing to God consciousness. So that peace treaty that was made to help the poor, and of course among them were orphans, who had been, they've been orphaned because of the battle, the war during the sacred months. So to help them is a sign of faith. I will point out here as well that if you look at the actions of Abdul Muttalib and Abu Talib, alayhi wasalam, but again, their actions, and if we really read their history, we see that, yes, whatever they did was also in line with faith, that they had iman. They were not folks who were among those individuals who were, you could say, in that state of jahiliyyah, whereby they were idol worshippers. No, they had iman, they had faith. The actions that are mentioned here also kind of, you could say, verify that. Even if we look at the poetry, and we mentioned one year about the poetry of Abu Talib as well, where he speaks about faith. There are indications that he believed in the nubuwwat of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And likewise, we'll indicate another thing when we get to the point about the Prophet's marriage to Khadija, alayhi wasallam. So there's one of the bullet points we have here. And so there's a strong relationship between the actions of a person and faith, that their actions will also indicate on their faith and their iman, what they believe.
It's interesting that the surah talks about who is not a moment.
Yes, yes.
It defines not a moment.
Exactly, it defines who's not a mu'min. And so the people who don't do these actions, they belie the day of judgment. They don't take care of the orphans or those who are disadvantaged. They don't help feed the poor, things like that. Then yes, they don't have iman.
And they're careless with their prayers.
Exactly, and careless with their prayers. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And وَيَمْنَعُونَ الْمَاعُونَ, they withhold that which is necessary for life from others. And of course, those who are online, if you have questions or comments you want to chime in, no problem. You can write into the chat, and then we'll address the questions that you may have, or any comments that you want to bring forth as well. So that next phase of the Prophet's life, 595 Common Era, where we pointed out one of the significant aspects of the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was his marriage to Lady Khadija. And this is a marriage which we stated, and mashallah, we just commemorated her wafat. It is one in which we see again the actions not only of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but also of Abu Talib, because the Prophet of Allah, he was married to Khadija while he was under the guardianship of Rasulullah, under the guardianship of Abu Talib. So we see that marriage that came, again, aligning perfectly with the Quran. Also, because when we read the history of Jahiliyyah, and what we read in a lot of the history, even if we look at the history as it's portrayed, even in several, say, historians who are academics, or if you go to the sources in Arabic, you will see that it was at least a common practice among the Arab at that time, at least those who were living by the codes of Jahiliyyah, that they didn't bother to enter into this custom or practice of marriage and going through these wedding ceremonies. In fact, when you look at a great deal of even the poetry of the Jahiliyyah, many of them, again, lived by the code of Jahiliyyah. Of course, there were some who didn't, but those who lived by that code of Jahiliyyah, they took pride in abducting women. They will abduct women. And this is also why there was no value for the life of those babies, if one gave birth to a girl, if that tribe was not a tribe that was strong enough to defend itself and to defend the women of that tribe, so one of the reasons why they buried those daughters alive, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنبٍ قُتِلَتْ, and on the day of judgment, these young baby girls, they will question and they will ask about for what sin were they buried. Some of the tribes, if they knew that, look, we're not good warriors, or many of our strong warriors, they have died, and so we will not be able to protect the women folk of our clan, so they will bury the daughters. So no, yes, we don't want to deal with that. Why? Because they'll get abducted. That was one cause of the burial of the daughters. Another is simply not having, again, high regards for women. Why? Because they would quite often abduct the women. And of course, one of the one of the famous poems, the Mu'allaqat, that was actually hung from the Kaaba during the period of Jahiliyyah, is by a poet by the name of Antara. And one of his famous poems is about how he would, again, and it was known from his history, how he would constantly have to save his cousin, and it was a female cousin who he fell in love with, and of course his uncle didn't want him to marry her, but his uncle's clan, they could not actually protect her. So eventually he ran away with her, as doing a kind of eloped with her. But nonetheless, he was constantly, on several occasions, he would come, like after she was abducted from her uncle's house, he would go and he would fight the tribe, whoever abducted her, and take her back, bring her back to the house. He says, and like, hey, allow me to marry my cousin. And he would say, oh, you can't protect her. Her name was Abla. So this shows the custom of the Arab at that time. As well, during the kind of a custom that was outlawed in Islam, with regards to like what happens, when a person mourns. So because women were often abducted as well after the wars during Jahiliyyah, so there was a custom that the women, especially the women who didn't want to get abducted, they would take their fingernails and they would dig it into their face and scratch their face up. They would pull their hair out, again, supposedly to kind of make themselves seem less attractive, so they wouldn't be abducted. If they did this when they saw that maybe their tribe was losing, and they knew that, oh well, if our menfolk are dying on this battlefield, and we're just left alone, then we're going to be abducted. And they didn't want to be abducted. So they would pull their hair out, they would scratch themselves and kind of destroy their beauty. So on the opposite end of that, we see this marriage of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Likewise, the marriage of Abu Talib himself, again, historically, they went and they married their wives. The marriage of Abdul Muttalib to Salma as well. He went to the family and proposed. All of these things are in line with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He states in Surah An-Nisa, verse 25, it says, فَانْكِحُوهُنَّ بِإِذْنِ أَهْلِهِنَّ وَآتُوهُنَّ أُجُورَهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. So Allah says, marry them, take wives, take your wife, but you do so by the permission of the family. This is a custom when we look at the Din al-Hanif, the religion of Ibrahim and Ismail, where we see the revelation that was revealed to Musa, to Isa. This was the custom, this was the practice. But the Jahiliyyah, they didn't practice that. But those who were living in this atmosphere of Jahiliyyah, but they were still practicing the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no, they went forth and they married their spouses based on that permission. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he points out, and this is what happened with the Prophet of Allah and Khadijah. Also, in that union, we find that, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he states in Surah Furqan, verse 47, that marriage was something that was sacred. And so in that sacred marriage, those individuals who are servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they not only look out for the worldly well-being of their family, but also the spiritual wellness of their family. And this is why when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he describes the Ibad al-Rahman, he says, وَالَّذِينَ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ وَجَعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. That, oh Allah, that make our wives and make our children, make them those who are the sparkle of the eye, or the seed of our eye, the joy of our eye, and that joyfulness is because of their spiritual aptitude. I just want to here just to show you the how this marriage also unfolded in its participation, where Abu Talib, alayhi salam, that he actually read the sermon for the wedding of Rasulullah and Khadijah. And when he read that sermon, these are the words that we have recorded in our narrations about what that sermon was, where Abu Talib, he says, Alhamdulillah alladhi ja'alana min zara'i Ibrahim wa dhurriyyati Ismail. So immediately he's praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again showing the iman of Abu Talib. And then showing the status of the Quraysh, and particularly that lineage of Abdul Muttalib. This is that we are from the loins of Ibrahim and from the offspring of Ismail. Mentioning them because they are prophets. And these are prophets that, again, no one at that time would have any doubt about, that we are from Ibrahim and Ismail. This is where our lineage goes back to. وَجَعَلَ لَنَا بَيْتًا مَحْجُوجًا. And he says, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has blessed us and he's made for us, in other words, in place the house in which others, they make hajj to, they make their pilgrimage to. This is in our care. So this is how Abu Talib, he introduces this scenario for the marriage of Rasulullah, that one, we're from the lineage of Ibrahim and Ismail. Abu Talib, he could have said, oh, well, we're from Abdul Manaf or some other individuals who very well may be also prophets, Anbiya. But people may doubt in that. But he gave the two names that no one would doubt, that these are the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we're from them, and we are the caretakers of the Bayt al-Mahjuj, the house which people make pilgrimage to, the very house that Ibrahim and Ismail, they built, and then also it was rebuilt by Rasulullah and the tribes, rebuilt, and the black stone was placed in it by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this gives you some background about the sacredness of that union. Did you see this question? Okay. So there's a question, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's not a history question, but, and this is a question from someone online. It's not a history question, but there's so much emphasis in Islam to take care of the widows and the orphans. The method used back then and the resources available are very different than today. Okay. Is there any good example of a successful Islamic orphanage? Is there an example? Perhaps. And I think we would have to look in maybe Muslim countries that, I know that there are some, I know in Iran, and they give importance to it, and in Iraq as well. There are orphanages, Muslim orphanages. When I visited India as well, I know that there were orphanages there as well that the Muslims were donating, taking care of. I believe Lana Kalbi Sadiq Saab, he was a big supporter of the orphans and took care of orphanages. So I'm sure that they are good examples. I don't know any specifically off the top of my head, but if I can go to Pakistan, India, Iran, Iraq, these Afghanistan as well, I'm sure they have orphanages there. So second part of the question is, where does support of orphans fall in social priorities of Muslim? Well, it falls in a very high priority. And this is why we see that it is mentioned in the Quran several times about the orphans, looking after the orphans, taking care of the orphans. Even Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he states about, even rubbing the head of the orphan, just showing affection to the orphan, so he doesn't feel that, they are alone, that they're, not wanted, they don't have anyone to support them. The Prophet Allah said, even during this, he says, the person who does that, then that person is granted paradise. So that is a very high priority of Muslims to take care of the orphans. And the third part of the question, assuming all children are Muslim, do children of Muslims take priority over orphans of non-Muslims? So again, when we speak of orphans, at least the kind of, we could say the shara'i definition or kind of criterion for it is someone who is not or hasn't reached the age of bulugh. So anyone who is under the age is not baligh. And this may be, again, I don't know about orphanages in, like I said, Islamic countries. I'm not sure of their structure and how long the child stays there or not. But at least in the system here, usually until the person is considered an adult legally, which is 18, then they may be, if they haven't been adopted at that point, they have some sort of system where the child can go out and begin to work and be on their own. But Islamically, technically, that person who is considered the orphan is that person who hasn't reached to the age of bulugh. And once they reach to the age of bulugh, they won't have that category of being an orphan, even though they lost their parents. They may be someone who falls into another category where they're considered to be kind of miskeen, destitute, or in a situation of need. And so you still are able to help that person. You should help those individuals. But orphan is kind of a particular category in Islam. And so that person who does fall in that category of being a yatim, based on what we see in the Quran and based on what we find in the riwayat, it does not differentiate whether that yatim is Muslim or not Muslim. In fact, if let's say a Muslim family came and they took care of a yatim that was not Muslim, and they raised them with the etiquettes of Islam, and that person grew up to be Muslim, there's a lot of reward in that. Not only reward for taking care of the orphan, but then reward for guiding someone to the path of truth. So you will have a double reward. But of course, how great of a scale of that reward for doing either one, Allahu A'lam. Allah knows best. So another question, is taking care of the orphans a global affair or a community one? If we hear, if we here send funds to orphans in the Middle East, would that suffice the responsibility? Yes, taking care of the orphans, again, it's a global affair. This global affair is something that is local as well. And it is something that, and I'll mention this so that it is really clear how it also connects with community. And some people, they will recite the verse of, oh, hey, you know what? It's some say it's a right, although other scholars, they say, no, it's an obligation based on the circumstances about taking more than one wife. And when we look at the verse that talks about that, it is directly connected to the orphans. Why? Which unfortunately, a lot of times, most people, they completely overlook that. Oh yeah, it's okay to take 4, 3, so it's marry 2, 3, or 4. I wonder if you can. If you take the entire verse into consideration, as many of the scholars said, you're talking about the orphans, that those women who will be single mothers and those children who will not have a guardian. So then he has the ability and step in and to take care of the orphan. And usually the orphan is one, like I said, is under the age of, is not baligh, and has lost their father. When they've lost both parents and they also underage, then they're considered miskeen. And these are very fine definitions of the Sharia. They lost both parents and they haven't reached the age of baligh, they're miskeen. They're not simply yatim, not simply orphaned. Yes, they're orphaned and they have absolutely no one. So someone has to come in and support it. If they're orphaned, then maybe they have a brother. And this is where that verse about taking 2 or 3, why? Because that child does not have a, you could say, a male figure in their life. So one should come in, sub in, and to fulfill that role. So it is a global issue about orphans. It is a communal issue. Yes, when we look at it in that perspective, the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he describes in the Quran, and also Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and the Ahlul Bayt describe it within the riwayat.
So marry single moms?
That is possible, yes. That's one scenario, yes.
So taking care of the orphan, is it an obligation? Is it the personal obligation or it's a community?
Well, taking care of the orphans, it would fall under the category which is called wajib kifai. So wajib kifai means that it is communal in a sense. However, when a single person or multiple people, whatever it takes, if it takes one person to come forth to take care of the orphan, then once that duty is fulfilled, then other people are relieved of that obligation. But if, let's say, in order to take care of the orphan, I'm just throwing a scenario, that it needs more than one person, 2 people, to, again, pitch in financially or to give their time to help bring this orphan up, then if one person steps forth, then the obligation is still on everyone else until the second person or other people step up in order to take care of the orphan. All right. So going to that next phase, and we'll try to finish this so that the Quran circle will start. Going to that next phase of the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and that is during the reconstruction of the Kaaba. One thing that it should be kind of pointed out here, and we kind of mention it in that section where we were talking about the marriage of Khadija as well. The Kaaba, this house, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in Surah Al-Imran, Inna awwala baytin wudi'a lil-nasi lalladhi bi-Bakkata mubarakan wa hudan lil-alamin. That this house that was the first place of worship for mankind, first place of worship, again, for anyone who is considered to be Bani Adam. This was the first place of worship. Because Adam, as we know, that he is the one who, also when he was sent forth to this earth from the Garden of Eden, wherever that may be, some say it was on earth, some say it was in paradise, Allahu A'lam. But nonetheless, one of the things that Adam, he did, that he was commanded by Allah, was to build the Kaaba. And then in the flood of Noah, it was destroyed. Ibrahim and Ismail, they rebuilt the Kaaba. Again, the Kaaba was destroyed during the lifetime of Rasulullah, before he was sent or before he announced his prophethood. And again, the prophet, he helped rebuild the Kaaba. So this Kaaba, it is something that is, you could say, central to the idea and the concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's connection to humanity. So when we see the Prophet's participation in that important event of rebuilding the Kaaba, and him being the one that is placing the black stone back into the Kaaba itself, because, again, this is another place where we see that the Prophet's life, even before he is delivering the message to people, it coincides completely with the Quran. Because during that event as well, when we read in the history, why did the tribes agree that, okay, yes, we'll allow the Muhammad ibn Abdullah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, why would we allow him to take his Abba, use his Abba, and then we all just simply grab a corner of it or a piece of it? He picks up the black stone, puts it on his Abba, and then we walk it over to the Kaaba, and he picks it up out of his own Abba and he places it there. This is because at that time, the Prophet of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was considered Sadiqun Ameen. He was considered the one to be truthful and to be trustworthy. He was that individual, again, prior to the time that he's delivering the message, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Innaka la'ala khuluqin azim." That Rasulullah, you have the best of manners. He was already recognized as that. And that's why no one disagreed. So, oh, okay, because they were disagreeing and almost got into a war with one another. Who's going to pick up the black stone? Who's going to put it back? The Prophet said, look, here's what I'll do. I'll take my Abba, you put it there. And if you all agree, everyone grabs the part, and then I will move it from the ground to the Abba, and from my Abba to the thing. Do you all agree? And because of his truthfulness, because of his manners, because he had the khuluqin azim, even before the bi'tha, everyone agreed to it. And that is, again, another connection that we find between Rasulullah and this sacred house of worship. Of course, that the khutbah of Abu Talib during the marriage, it also sets also that precedence as well, that the Quraysh, that the lineage of Abdul Muttalib, had Abdullah, the father of Rasulullah, been alive, that he would also probably be in that one who's a caretaker of Kaaba. But Abu Talib, he was a caretaker of the Kaaba at that time, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, again, was instrumental in rebuilding and placing the black stone there. So these are not coincidence in the life of Rasulullah. These are moments that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he wants to point out to us that even prior to the bi'tha, that the Prophet, he was a prophet. And at the bi'tha, he became the messenger, he became the Rasul. But he had the maqam of Nabuwwah, he had this prophethood prior to that. Now, our last time period in this particular session deals with 610 Common Era. Of course, this is the moment in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he sent Jibreel to the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and told him, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq." This is a point in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is now telling Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now it is your responsibility to go forth and to deliver this message, to deliver the revelation, the final revelation to mankind. And of course, one couple of points that we can point out here before we end our session is that, again, the beginning of this revelation is, I think, significant in that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first command that he makes is what? Iqra, read. Read. And in that reading and that command of reading, there's a message of one of the things we've been talking about so much is a tarbiyah. And that tarbiyah, that development, that growth, that education, it comes to reading. And reading those things which will also, again, be a means of our growth, those things which will connect us with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or connect us with our duty and responsibility in life, which again connects us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even if we don't think, and unfortunately sometimes, and this is because of how in the modern sense, the sciences and knowledge has been just broken apart and categorized in two different things. No, everything is an ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If someone is studying chemistry, this is ayat of Allah. It's not simply, oh, well, hey, we're studying chemistry or we're studying physics, and it has nothing to do with being a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has nothing to do with connecting us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Oh, well, hey, I'm studying computer science. Well, yes, that's fine. But even in that knowledge and understanding, there's a connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because all knowledge connects back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, when we even, one of the basics of even computer science is the algorithms that we study. Of course, it goes back to mathematics. And the algorithms of mathematics was developed by a Muslim mathematician, polyglot, Muhammad ibn Khwarazmi. But nonetheless, anything that we study, that we read, that we come across, it should connect us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't think that for 1 minute is simply something that's mundane. Oh, well, this only has a worldly aspect to it. Yes, there's a worldly aspect to it, but that worldly thing in it and understanding it is a way to connect it back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says here, الَّذِي عَلَّمَ بِالْقَلَمِ. He taught man with a pen. So if we simply I don't have a pen in front of me, but if we had a pen, then just think that, well, how does this little container of ink, how does that connect us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How does that make me reflect about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Seems like a very simple creation. Something that man put together. But whereas it's the elements of that, who created the source of those elements that we kind of make ink, or we derive ink from, or we derive plastic from, or we derive the metal from? Who's the creator of all those things? We certainly didn't create it. We just took these sources and we put it together. So everything that we study, that we read, that we come across, reflect on how it connects us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It takes us back to or reminds us of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in that, we will understand the great revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So are there any questions, comments, complaints? Inshallah, so we will end here, and next week we will, I think we have a session as well, I believe, and inshallah we'll pick up from where we left out. Or actually tomorrow we have a session, so that works. So tomorrow, inshallah, we'll see you around the same time. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.